Lu Han never believed in serendipity. He'd always thought of life as a series of predictable events, deterministic, controlled, and free from the chaos of the unknown. As a man of logic and precision, his life was crafted with the same meticulousness he used in the construction of buildings. He was, after all, the head of security at a state-of-the-art tech corporation, where order, efficiency, and strength were paramount. But on that Thursday afternoon, fate came crashing in with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Lu Han was on his usual rounds at one of the company's under-construction sites, overseeing the integrity of the perimeter and ensuring everything was up to code. His steel-toed boots scraped the concrete as he walked, his stiff posture like that of a soldier ready for inspection. He was a fortress, unyielding, unbending. His colleagues called him the steel wall behind his back, and they weren't wrong. Lu Han had little room in his life for anything that wasn't calculated, for emotions that only blurred his focus. He'd spent years erasing any semblance of vulnerability from his soul. His mind was elsewhere, on his checklists, on the meeting later in the day, on the perfect glass of scotch he'd enjoy later that evening, alone, as always. It was then that he heard a faint voice, calling out from a distance, "Help, help me." Lu Han barely glanced up. The voice sounded faint, maybe a distant echo of some construction worker's shout, but the instinct to ignore it was strong. After all, this site was off-limits to anyone who wasn't authorized, and those who breached the boundaries usually ended up in trouble. But the voice came again, this time louder and more desperate, "Please. Somebody, help." Lu Han's eyes narrowed. This was unusual. There were no workers in the area he was patrolling, only a few unsecured scaffolds and unfinished concrete blocks. He took a few more steps forward, his movements deliberate, as if walking through a fog that hadn't quite registered in his mind. Then, as he rounded a corner of the building, his gaze froze. There, standing precariously on the edge of a steep drop, was a little girl. No more than 6 years old, her small frame perched dangerously atop a pile of steel beams. She was looking down with wide, terrified eyes, her tiny hands clutching the edge of the scaffolding. Lu Han's breath caught in his chest, and his first instinct was to rush toward her, but then he remembered his training. His eyes scanned the situation with methodical precision. He would approach slowly, calmly, make sure she was out of harm's way. But as he took a step forward, his foot caught on a stray cable. The world around him seemed to collapse in slow motion. He lost his footing and, in a spectacular moment of clumsiness, crashed into a stack of loose materials. The pile teetered dangerously, sending scrap metal crashing toward the girl's direction. Instinct took over. Lu Han shot forward, pushing against the steel debris, his massive body moving with surprising grace despite the earlier misstep. He reached out, grabbing the girl just as the heavy scrap came tumbling down beside them. His body hit the ground with a resounding thud, his arms wrapped tightly around the girl, who was now gasping for air. For a split second, there was nothing but the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had done it. He had saved her. But as he lay there, cradling the small child in his arms, something strange stirred deep inside him. The feeling was unfamiliar, something soft, something human. For years, Lu Han had lived a life of emotional detachment. His job, his daily routine, everything he did was carefully calculated to avoid any distractions from his goal, perfection. But this moment? This was something else. It was raw, it was vulnerable, and it was terrifying. The girl's tiny hands gripped his shirt, and she looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice soft but sincere. Lu Han's breath was shaky, his chest rising and falling in a way that felt foreign. He nodded stiffly, unsure of what to say. His mind tried to compute the situation as he always did, logically, pragmatically. But it kept circling back to her, to the warmth of her little hands clutching his, to the utter absence of fear he felt in the presence of such innocence. She was safe now. But Lu Han wasn't so sure about himself. The days that followed were a blur for Lu Han. He had escorted the little girl, whose name was Xiao Wan, to her mother's office, but he couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He told himself it was a simple matter of instinct, of duty. He'd saved a child. It was what anyone would do. But there was something else. A lingering warmth in his chest. Something long dormant, something that had no place in his life. He found himself returning to the site more often than necessary. He hadn't quite let go of the image of Qiao Wen, her innocent, trusting face, her wide eyes filled with gratitude. It bothered him, this gnawing sensation in his chest. What was it? Why did he feel so unsettled? It wasn't like him. It shouldn't have been. His routine remained largely unchanged. Mornings were spent in sterile precision, work was a series of calculated actions, and evenings were spent alone in his minimalist apartment, staring blankly at a book he didn't read, or a glass of scotch he didn't drink. But even in those solitary moments, the image of Qiao Wen seemed to float before him, unbidden. One evening, weeks after the incident, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Zhao Hui, Qiao Wen's mother. "Thank you for saving my daughter. She wants to see you again. Are you free tomorrow?" The message was simple, polite, but it left Lu Han frozen. He hadn't expected to hear from them again. He hadn't expected to feel anything in return. And yet, here he was, staring at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He debated, his mind at war with itself. Should he go? What did it mean to him? Why did he care? With a strange sense of inevitability, he typed back. "Yes, I'll come." The next day, Lu Han arrived at the small, cozy apartment where Zhao Hui and Qiao Wen lived. As soon as the door opened, Qiao Wen rushed to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Thank you for saving me," she exclaimed, her face a bright mixture of gratitude and wonder. Lu Han stood stiffly, unsure how to react. He patted her awkwardly on the head, the touch foreign to him. Zhao Hui smiled warmly from the doorway. "You're welcome to stay for dinner, Lu Han. Qiao Wen has been asking about you for days." Lu Han hesitated. He hadn't been to someone's home for a meal in years. Social niceties were not his thing. But something about the simplicity of the invitation, the warmth in Zhao Hui's voice, tugged at something deep inside him. He agreed, and they sat down for a simple meal of rice, vegetables, and fish. Qiao Wen's innocent questions about his life, about his work, his routine, his likes and dislikes, felt like an assault on everything Lu Han had built. She spoke with such openness, such unguarded curiosity, that it was impossible not to feel a little lost. He answered her questions mechanically, but inside, something was shifting. By the end of the evening, as he left the apartment, Lu Han's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, none of them clear. He wasn't sure what was happening to him. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to know, but one thing was certain. Qiao Wen had awakened something in him. And no amount of logic, no amount of control, was going to change that. Lu Han couldn't explain it. He had spent most of his life deliberately distancing himself from the world of emotions, and yet, here he was, feeling something he hadn't in years, something that felt dangerously close to warmth, to tenderness. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't practical. It wasn't logical. He had to remain detached. That was the only way to function in a world that demanded efficiency, precision, and, most importantly, control. But control was slipping away. When he returned to his apartment that night, the silence seemed louder than usual. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the slight rustle of wind outside his window, it all felt foreign, alien to him. He poured himself a drink, as he often did after a long day, but tonight, the alcohol didn't soothe the way it usually did. The burn of the liquor seemed to emphasize the emptiness in his chest, a void that he couldn't quite explain. He thought about Qiao Wen, her bright eyes, the trust in her voice when she thanked him, the way she clung to him as if he were the safest person in the world. She hadn't seen him as a cold, emotionless security officer, she'd only seen him as someone who had saved her life. In her world, the complexities of fear, rejection, and emotional scars didn't exist. She saw only the hero. That image gnawed at him. By the time the glass was empty, Lu Han was certain of one thing: he couldn't keep this up. He couldn't keep pretending that he was fine, that he was unaffected, that he was simply going through the motions. Something inside him had been awakened. The next few days were an exercise in frustration. Lu Han had tried to bury himself in his work, but the constant presence of thoughts about Xiaowen made it impossible. Every conversation with his colleagues, every meeting with his superiors, felt increasingly hollow. The emotional distance he had always maintained was now an uncomfortable chasm that he couldn't cross. It wasn't just that he was questioning his own humanity, it was that he had no idea how to stop it. And so, he found himself back at Zhao Hui and Xiaowen's apartment, drawn there not by obligation but by something deeper, something more insistent. The door opened with the same warmth as before, but this time, it felt different. He felt different. Xiaowen ran to him again, her face lighting up when she saw him. Lu Han. You came back, she beamed, and something twisted painfully inside him. Her simple joy, her complete trust in him, made him feel both elated and crushed at the same time. The little girl was a reminder of everything he had pushed aside. She was innocence incarnate, and her world was untouched by the coldness that had shaped his. It wasn't fair to her, to expect her to understand the gulf between them. But it didn't stop him from coming back. Zhao Hui welcomed him into the apartment with a quiet understanding, as if she sensed the storm brewing beneath Lu Han's calm exterior. They sat at the table again, eating the same simple meal. The conversation flowed easily, with Xiaowen chiming in with questions about Lu Han's work and his life. He answered mechanically, but his mind was miles away, struggling with the constant push and pull of emotions he couldn't control. You never talk about your family, Lu Han, Zhao Hui said casually, setting down a dish of vegetables. Do you have anyone? A wife, maybe? The question caught Lu Han off guard. For a moment, he was silent, unsure how to answer. His mind flashed to the years of loneliness, of choosing work over everything else, of avoiding any connection that might complicate things. He'd never wanted a family, never allowed himself to imagine that kind of life. I've never been married, he said, his voice even. Work has always been enough. Zhao Hui nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I understand. It's hard to balance everything. But you should know, Lu Han, that life isn't just about what you do, it's about who you are. Who you allow yourself to become. Maybe sometimes, people like you forget what it means to feel. But it's never too late. Lu Han couldn't meet her gaze. Her words echoed in his mind long after dinner was finished and he had left their apartment. It wasn't too late. Could it be? Could he truly go back to a life where he allowed himself to feel things again? Could he become the man he had once been, or had he completely abandoned that version of himself? Days turned into weeks. Lu Han found himself drawn to the little girl more than ever, each visit to their apartment eroding the walls he had spent years building. The mechanical precision of his life was being replaced by something softer, more fluid, more human. And he hated it. He couldn't focus at work. He couldn't ignore the tug in his chest whenever he thought of Xiaowen, the way her smile seemed to make the world feel just a little less cold. And yet, the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how deeply he had changed. The distance that once separated him from the world around him had narrowed, until he could no longer see the world through the same lens. Everything had shifted, and he didn't know how to go back to what he once was. It wasn't long before Xiaowen started calling him her friend. She would often run up to him, grab his hand, and drag him to the playground near her home, showing him all her favorite things. She would ask him to push her on the swing, or she would tell him stories about her day. She seemed so innocent, so unafraid, that Lu Han began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could be the kind of person she believed him to be. I like when you come to visit, Xiaowen told him one afternoon, her voice filled with innocence and trust. "You're nice. And you always keep me safe." Lu Han swallowed hard, feeling something tighten in his chest. The words hit him harder than anything else had. They weren't just a child's innocent compliment, they were a reflection of everything he had missed out on, everything he had failed to see. "You're safe," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. For the first time in years, Lu Han was aware of how profoundly human his desire to protect Xiaowen had become. It wasn't about duty. It wasn't about his job or his sense of responsibility. It was about something deeper, something buried deep inside him that had awakened in response to her vulnerability, to her unwavering trust. For weeks, Lu Han fought this internal battle. He couldn't deny it any longer. He couldn't pretend that he was the same person he had been before he met Xiaowen. He had tried to protect her, and in the process, he had found himself on the other side of the wall he had spent years building. It was one night, as he stood on the balcony of his apartment, staring out at the city lights, that it all became clear. The city stretched out before him, a vast landscape of lights and steel, a world that had once felt like his domain, his fortress. But now, it seemed distant, almost insignificant in comparison to the realization that had finally broken through. He wasn't the steel wall anymore. He was a man, with all the complexities that came with being human, and maybe, just maybe, he could learn to embrace that. The days that followed were a quiet transformation. Lu Han's heart had slowly been opening, and he no longer feared the emotions that had once seemed so foreign to him. With each passing visit, his connection with Xiaowen deepened. They spent afternoons together, just talking or playing, and Lu Han found himself smiling, something he hadn't done in years. One afternoon, as they sat together on the swings in the park, Xiaowen turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Lu Han, do you have dreams?" His brow furrowed. The question was simple, yet it cut to the heart of everything he had avoided. He had spent so long focusing on what was practical, on what made sense, that he had long forgotten the idea of dreams, of possibilities that didn't fit into a carefully constructed world. "I don't think I have many dreams," he replied, his voice quiet. "At least, not like you do." Xiaowen smiled, a smile that was pure and full of hope. "You should," she said, swinging higher. "Everyone should have dreams. It's what makes life fun." Lu Han watched her, the wind lifting her hair, her joy so unburdened by the weight of the world. And in that moment, he realized something profound. He wasn't just existing anymore. He was living. He was truly alive. For the first time in a long while, Lu Han allowed himself to believe in the possibility of dreams. Not just for Xiaowen, but for himself too. Lu Han sat quietly on the park bench, the cool evening air brushing against his face as he watched Xiaowen playing on the swings. The rhythm of her laughter, light and carefree, filled the space around him, mingling with the distant hum of the city. He had spent his life in a world of concrete and steel, surrounded by noise and precision. But now, in the stillness of this park, something felt different, like the noise had faded away, leaving room for something softer, something he hadn't known he needed until now. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, and for a moment, Lu Han allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe in deeply. He didn't rush to stand up, didn't hurry to fill the space with thoughts or questions. There was no checklist to complete, no security protocol to follow. For the first time in a long while, there was simply the present, just the here and now, the warmth of the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, and the sound of Xiaowen's delighted voice as she pushed herself higher on the swing. He could feel the pull of something inside him, a question that had been rising for days now, a curiosity that had been gnawing at the edges of his awareness. The thing he had buried for so long was demanding his attention again, the thing that made him feel both vulnerable and alive, the possibility of hope. Could he truly go back to the life he had before Xiaowen? Could he return to the cold, mechanical man he had been? No. The answer came to him as easily as a breath. He couldn't. Something had changed, and not just in him but in the world around him. It wasn't something as tangible as the new routines he was starting to follow. No, it was something deeper, an undercurrent that ran through every moment he spent with Xiao Wen. Her innocence had broken something in him that had remained locked for years, and now, he wasn't sure he could ever lock it away again. He watched as Xiao Wen, laughing, jumped off the swing and ran toward him. Her hair was flying behind her like a halo of joy, and for a brief, irrational moment, Lu Han thought how much of the world seemed to open up when she was near. She was so small, yet so large in her capacity to change everything she touched. "You're smiling, Lu Han," she exclaimed, her voice full of that unfiltered joy that seemed to come so naturally to her. "I guess I am," Lu Han replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It felt strange, like trying on a coat that didn't quite fit, but for some reason, it didn't feel wrong. It felt right. She giggled and plopped down beside him on the bench, her legs dangling off the edge as she leaned her head on his shoulder. He stiffened at first, the motion unfamiliar. But then, just as quickly, he let himself relax, let the moment unfold without resistance. The world didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need to follow any blueprint. It was enough just to be here, in this fleeting moment. "Can I ask you something?" Xiao Wen's voice was soft but serious, pulling him out of his reverie. Lu Han turned to her, surprised by the weight of her tone. "Of course. What is it?" "Do you like having a family?" she asked, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that was far beyond her years. The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought about family in a long time, certainly not since he had stopped visiting his parents years ago. It had seemed like such a distant concept, an idea that didn't really fit in with the life he had built. But now, with Xiao Wen sitting beside him, her small hand resting on his arm, it felt different. The question didn't feel like an innocent inquiry, it felt like something more. He considered the question carefully, letting the silence stretch between them for a moment. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of traffic, but it was all background noise. "I never really thought about it," he said slowly. "But now, maybe it's something I could learn about. Maybe it's something I could want." Xiao Wen smiled brightly at him, as if she had just solved a great mystery. "I think you'd be a good dad," she said matter-of-factly. "You protect people. You care about them. You're just a little shy, that's all." Lu Han chuckled quietly, the sound unfamiliar in his own ears. The idea of being a father, of being responsible for someone's heart, was an alien thought, something he had never allowed himself to entertain. But now, with Xiao Wen's innocent certainty hanging in the air, he realized that maybe he didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe it was enough to start with the desire to try. As the evening stretched into night, Lu Han stood, offering a hand to help Xiao Wen up. She took it without hesitation, her grip warm and small in his. They walked slowly toward the edge of the park, the city skyline looming in the distance, its lights twinkling like a far-off dream. "You're going to be okay, you know," Xiao Wen said suddenly, looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. Lu Han stopped walking, startled by the depth of her words. "What do you mean?" "I just know," she replied, shrugging as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "You'll figure it out. You're not as broken as you think you are." Her words hit him like a stone, breaking through the armor he had built for years. He had always thought of himself as someone who couldn't be fixed, someone who didn't deserve to be whole. He had allowed himself to exist in a state of mechanical detachment, convincing himself that he was fine, that he was in control. But now, looking at Xiao Wen, he felt the truth of her statement. She was right. He wasn't broken. He had just been lost. With a deep breath, Lu Han nodded, feeling something shift inside him. "I'll try," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time in what felt like forever. The days turned into weeks, and Lu Han found himself in unfamiliar territory. He was learning to open up, to share parts of himself he had kept hidden for so long. It wasn't easy. It never was. There were days when the weight of his old life pressed down on him, reminding him of the cold, calculated man he used to be. But with each passing day, he found it easier to look past the walls he had built. He found it easier to let people in. Xiaowen continued to be his guide, her innocence and unfiltered joy reminding him of the simple pleasures he had long forgotten. She had a way of making him see the world in a new light, a way of making him feel alive again. It was as if the world had always been full of color, but he had been too blind to see it until she showed him how. Zhao Hui, too, played her part. She didn't pressure him, didn't try to push him into any boxes or timelines. She simply offered him kindness, something he had never truly known how to accept. And slowly, like a flower opening to the sun, Lu Han found himself thawing, his heart growing softer with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together in Zhao Hui's apartment, the small family gathered around the table, Lu Han realized something. It wasn't the grand moments, the grand gestures, that made life worth living. It wasn't the perfect achievements or the spotless reputation. It was the quiet moments, the simple connections, the shared silences and the unspoken understanding. It was the feeling of belonging that he looked around the table at the people who had slowly but surely changed him, and he realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. This, right here, was the life he had been afraid to embrace. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, Lu Han understood what it meant to truly live.